Ja, jag har träffat en av världens största och mest kända feminister, nämligen Susan Faludi, som har varit som en ikon för många feminister. Och nu så har hon skrivit en bok som många tror jag blir väldigt förvånade över att läsa, och den boken har också förändrat hennes liv. Det här handlar om ett möte med en pappa som inte alls visade sig vara den pappa hon trodde, och det handlar också om identiteter. Vad betyder de? Lyssna på den här intervjun. So, welcome Susan Faludi to my show.
Thank you.
I have really looked forward to have you here. And reading this book was like, I don't know what to say because I've never read anything like it. It's really an...
I've never written anything like it.
No, it is so... it's a lot of interesting questions that I have after reading this book. But to me, it was a question of identity. Finding your identity, going back to see if you could find something about yourself through your father. So I think if you would start to describe your childhood, would be for the people that are listening now easier to follow the story.
Yeah. So I grew up in a suburb of New York, and with my parents and my brother. And on the surface, it seemed like the classic, post-war American suburban family with a white picket fence and the barbecue and the dog. And
if I may interrupt you, we have a picture that is a very good picture that you could maybe describe, because it is really a picture that describes this kind of life.
Yes. This is actually before we moved to the suburbs. It's in Queens, in a borough of New York City, and that's my father and me in my early driving lessons. And that was my father's favorite Ford convertible. But beneath the surface, it was a pretty unhappy family life. My father was very angry all the time. We never knew why. My father was a mystery. He had sort of two ways of being: either utterly silent, wouldn't and never spoke of his past. I knew that he grew up in Hungary, as the only child of Jewish parents, and that terrible things happened during the Holocaust to my whole extended family. But my father said very, very little. And then every once in a while, my father would just blow up and would just be, erupt for sort of no reason. And we were all pretty afraid of him, and we tiptoed around him. And then ultimately, when I was about 17, my parents divorced, and my father was extremely upset, didn't want the divorce, and became increasingly physically violent. My father was also very controlling. I mean, kind of classic patriarch, wouldn't let my mother work, just wanted to control everything in the household.
Even you have, when you write about the two of you were out running, he couldn't let his daughter win.
Yes.
He was even controlling that.
Right. And I remember at the time thinking, we were racing each other, and because I was actually in training for I was in high school on the track team. I wasn't very good, but I was very persistent. And we ended up just heavily competing in this one run, and to the point where I was just almost ill from trying to keep up with my father. And I finally gave up and let him go ahead. And I remember thinking at the time, oh, it's in some ways it's easier to be a woman, which was a kind of funny thought that came back to me later when my father reemerged in my life.
But what kind of feelings did you have? Were you afraid of him?
Yes, I mean, we all were afraid of my father, and for good reason, because my father was sort of verbally violent for most of, my father wasn't physically violent until the end of my parents' marriage. So that was sort of 20 years into their marriage.
And then there is a special situation where he comes to your family, to your mother especially, with a knife.
Yeah.
Which really changed your life, sort of.
Right. Well, my mother, my father broke into the house, was, threatening her, and my mother got a restraining order. This is back in 1977, so the police didn't do very much. I mean, she did have this restraining order, but it was just a piece of paper, and my father ignored it. The sort of violence culminated in my father breaking in with a knife and a baseball bat and, sort of wreaking havoc in the middle of the night, and the police were called, and my father was arrested. My father was released by morning and just got a slap on the hand and paid a very tiny fine, and that was the end of it. And that my father's behavior and the way that the police and the law, and the courts and system dealt with that violence was profoundly influential in sparking my early feminism. Even at that age, I thought there's something wrong here with women should have the right to basic protection.
And you are one of the most famous feminists in the world, and there was that special situation that really was so profound in you.
Yeah, yes, and and also profound in my relationship with my father, because I took my mother's side, and my father was outraged about this and pretty much disowned me
and disappeared later.
And so for 27 years, we barely spoke to each other. I mean, when I wrote a book, I would send it to my father, and we had an occasional, once email came about, we had the occasional email exchange. I, would see him at a family wedding or a graduation, but really we were barely in contact.
But then there came a mail.
Yes.
That really changed everything.
Yes.
Could you describe that?
So I was sitting at home. It was the summer of 2004. And as it happened, I was going through my old notes on my last book, which was about masculinity. And I look up from filing those notes, and I had gotten an email, and it was, the subject line was changes, and it was from my father. And my father wrote, "Dear Susan, I have some interesting news for you," was how it began. "I have decided that I have had enough of impersonating a macho, aggressive man that I've never been inside." And attached to this email were a series of, selfie photos of my father wearing a dress, an evening gown, high heels. And the interest, yes, and a purse. And the interesting news was that my father, without telling anyone in the family or really telling anybody, had flown to Thailand and got gender reassignment surgery and was now a woman. I should add that my father at this point was 76 years old.
So what happened to you then? I mean, it's...
Yeah, it was a bolt out of the blue, to say, to understatement of the year. I mean, it was. There was no sign of this. It wasn't as if growing up I always thought, well, my father was confused.
It's quite the opposite sign.
Yes. No, it seemed that my father was kind of the ultimate patriarch and misogynist. And I remember that night after getting the email. My husband and I went to a classical music concert. It was Schnittke's Requiem for his mother, and it was this very sort of dissonant, emotional piece in memoriam to a parent. And listening to it, I was just overwhelmed and found myself just sitting there weeping and feeling ashamed of myself, because here I thought I had my father pegged. I thought I knew everything about, I had sort of sat in judgment of my father, and it turned out I knew nothing about this person I grew up with.
And then this journey of your life sort of starts.
Yes.
Because he invites you to come and visit his new life in Hungary.
Yes.
And it is also a journey to find yourself.
Yes. Well, I should say, so my father, after my parents divorced, my father first moved back into New York City, where my father was working as a photographer, actually working in, my father spent an entire career in the darkroom, hence the title of the book. And my father's specialty, interestingly, for great metaphor for this story, my father's photographic specialty was altering images. So
she was very, very good at.
Yes, so she was quite brilliant at, and a lot of the leading commercial fashion photographers of that time, Richard Avedon, Francesca Scavullo, Bert Stern, Irving Penn, they relied on my father to do these special alterations, color conversions, making a copy from a negative, or these techniques that have wonderful names like dodging and burning and masking. And so that's what my father was doing until 1990. And then with the fall of communism, my father decided to move back to Hungary, move to Budapest, which was kind of a mysterious thing for my father to do, given the traumatic upbringing my father had in Hungary during the Holocaust as a teenager who was Jewish.
Could you describe the first meeting with your father as being a woman?
Yes, so...
Because that was at the airport, he picked you up?
Yes. So after I got this email, I called my father very nervously, because we hadn't spoken in more than a quarter century. And my father invited me to come, and my father said, "You should write my story." And I'm a journalist, and so I packed up all my reporters' notebooks and my list of questions and my recording devices, and went over there. And so I'm coming out of the plane into the arrivals hall and looking around, thinking, "Am I even going to recognize my father?" And there she was, standing in a very, kind of sedate red cable sweater and kind of matronly, outfit, and with pearl earrings. She loved pearl earrings. And what was, again, learning more about myself in a way or revealing more about myself than my father. My first thought was, I saw that she had hung her purse on the luggage cart, and I thought, well, no woman would just hang her purse there. And I thought, here I am, I'm a lifelong feminist, and all of a sudden I have these essentialist views of a woman should be this way or a woman should be that way, which is absurd. Of course, you're not born knowing where to hang a purse. And so we walked, to my father's car and headed to her house. And I remember thinking, what was really striking was not the ways my father had changed by becoming a woman, but all the ways she was still really the same person, with that same anger, that same sadness, that same kind of faraway look in her
loneliness.
eye. And terrible loneliness.
Because it's a sad story how the two of you try to connect again, and you as a daughter try over and over again, please show me where you lived as a child, or show me this and that. But he doesn't want that. He wants only to show you what he wants you to know. Right.
So my father, in that first visit and for a number of years early on, wanted me to write the story of her present, of sort of the post, sex reassignment
as a woman.
Yeah, and of course, I, as a journalist, wanted to know the past and wanted to know, what shaped my father, why my father was the way he was back when she was a he. And so there was this struggle between I wanted to excavate old history, I wanted to know about my father's childhood, I wanted to know about my father's Holocaust experience, and my father would say, "Oh, that's ancient history, I'm not that person anymore. My father's name growing up was Stephen, and after the transition, my father took the name Stephanie. So my father would say, "I'm Stephanie now. We don't need to talk about those things."
But what were your feelings towards this new father, Stephanie?
I really hoped that my father, as the daughter, I hoped that my father would change. And I think there was a little bit of a fantasy of, oh, okay, now that my father's become a woman, she'll be more open. We can really, let our hair down, literally, and talk. And it wasn't
that easy.
Yeah, I mean, one doesn't really choose an identity. It doesn't work that way.
We have a picture with the two of you, and here it is. Is that in Hungary?
That's in Hungary. That's in on the Ciklo, which is this funicular, this little incline train up Castle Hill in Budapest, and was taken in 2010 by my husband, and it's my father. 5 years before she died, so she's about 83 years old there.
Was it a kind of reconciliation there in any way?
Eventually. I mean, at first we did a lot of yelling at each other and wound up battling over the past. As much as my father was saying, "Oh, that's ancient history," we were, arguing about the violence at the end of my parents' marriage, and my father was, yelling at me that I should have kept the family together. And we kind of went back to the old fights. But over time, that dropped away. And ultimately, my father decided she did want to get into her past. And we wound up going to the synagogue where she went as a child. We visited, the home where she grew up, and my father opened up to me.
And that helped you to understand yourself?
It was an incredible gift. I grew up, my father didn't talk about being Jewish. We had, Christmas lights on the house and the biggest Christmas tree on the street. And my father was just very, very hidden. And by hiding her past, she was hiding hiding the past that should have been my inheritance. So being able to learn all that was tremendously freeing for me.
And what did this do to your identity?
Well, I always knew I knew I felt Jewish. I knew I, was kind of fixated on gender issues, and I didn't know, I thought, well, that's just because I grew up in a very Catholic neighborhood and people weren't very friendly to Jews, so maybe I identified with it for that reason. And maybe, and I thought my feminism came out of just my father being a kind of macho man. But I realized there were so many more dynamics going on. And, I think we think of identity, we have this sort of egocentric idea of identity in our modern times, that it's something we choose, and it's all internal, and it's all individual to us. And what I learned in doing, in researching my family history and ultimately coming into connection with the larger extended family, this sort of far-flung Jewish diaspora, was a deeper understanding of my own history and these larger collective external connections that shape you as much as whatever is going on internally.
And at the same time, you did understand your father a little bit more.
Absolutely.
Because that's the feeling you get when you read the book.
Yes.
It's a funny story, it's a sad story, it's an interesting story. It has everything in it, and it puts the finger on identity questions, really. I can't let you go before asking about feminism today after Trump. Because
yes, are we going to survive this?
This will follow you always. But have you any... What do you think?
Oh, well, you know, right after the election, I think many of us, certainly those of us who care about women's rights, were pretty devastated. We were, you know, I spent a few days just lying on the floor, not even being able to look at the newspaper. But what, as horrifying as the election results are, and as misogynistic as Trump's appeal to voters was, the upside, if you can call it that, is that the reaction to the election from women has been sort of electrifying. I mean, starting with the day after Trump's inauguration with a huge women's march.
All over the world.
Yeah. And, you know, I worried that, oh, this will be just sort of a one-time thing. There will be a march, and then, because that's often happened in the past. There's kind of what seems like it's going to be a resurgence of feminism, and then things peter out. But that hasn't been the case this time. I mean, there are thousands and thousands of women's groups all over the United States that have formed at a local level, you know, very grassroots, working every day to, you know, deluging their local representatives and their representatives in the Senate and the House of Representatives, and just showing up at town halls and just raising hell. And I think it could be, you know, another
start for
a real wave of feminism. That's my hope.
And it's going to be a book that you would write.
We'll see.
We'll
yes,
see.
yeah. It's hard for me to stay away from that.
Yeah, but you're an optimist.
Most of the time I'm a cynic, but this is what's going on in the country is so disturbing. I mean, it is on every level. I mean, one of his first announcements was, you know, that he was signing a global gag rule against abortion, and he was, you know, talking about defunding Planned Parenthood, getting rid of legal abortion, you know, calls equal pay, you know, the equivalent of socialism, and then, you know, all these incredible misogynist epithets that have came out of his mouth during the election season. So there is a lot to push back against, and I think women in the country realize that. So.
Thank you so much for coming, and I hope a lot of people will read this Mörkrummet in Swedish dark room.
Sounds wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.